It is the 14th of May, 1915, and the sun has not yet cleared the ridgeline above Anzac Cove. A soldier presses himself flat against the crumbling wall of a trench barely deep enough to stand up straight in. Somewhere across no man's land, perhaps 200 meters away, perhaps less, a Turkish rifleman is waiting. He has been waiting for hours. He does not need to hurry. Every man in this trench knows that to raise his head above the parapet, even for a second, even just to look, is to invite a bullet through the skull. 3 men have died this way in the last 2 days alone, in this stretch of line no more than 50 meters long. The soldier crouching here is not thinking about strategy or empire or the wider war. He is thinking about how he is meant to shoot back at an enemy he is forbidden, on pain of death, to look at. This is the reality of the Gallipoli Peninsula in the spring of 1915, a landscape of dust, flies, and unrelenting observation. The Ottoman defenders, dug into high ground with commanding views over the Anzac positions below, have turned marksmanship into a form of siege warfare. British, Australian, and New Zealand troops clinging to a narrow strip of beach and scrub-covered gully find themselves pinned not by artillery, not by great offensives, but by the patient discipline of individual riflemen who need only to see a target to kill it. And so a strange and quietly desperate problem takes hold of the Allied line. How does a soldier fight an enemy he cannot afford to look at? The answer, when it comes, will not arrive from a factory in Birmingham or a laboratory in Whitehall. It will come from a soldier with a shaving mirror, a few nails, and a piece of wood, tinkering in a trench because necessity, as it so often does in war, refuses to wait for official invention. What follows is the story of a simple trick that changed the way soldiers fought and died on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and one of the quiet innovations of the First World War. The problem facing the Anzac and British forces at Gallipoli was not a shortage of rifles or ammunition. It was a shortage of geography. The men who had landed in April 1915 found themselves confined to a battlefield that favored the defender in almost every conceivable way. The Ottoman position sat higher, saw further, and controlled ground that had been fortified and ranged with rifles long before the first landing craft touched the beach. Trenches on both sides were often absurdly close together, in places no more than 15 or 20 meters apart, close enough that a man could hear his enemy coughing. In such conditions, a rifleman needed only patience and a steady eye to inflict a devastating toll. Casualty figures from the early weeks tell their own story. Entire companies reported that the majority of their losses came not from shellfire or bayonet charges, but from single bullets, fired by unseen marksmen, striking men who had exposed themselves for no more than an instant. Some units estimated that raising one's head above the parapet carried odds of death measured in seconds rather than minutes. The Ottoman army had, by necessity and by training, produced riflemen of considerable skill, men who understood their terrain intimately and who treated the taking of a single well-aimed shot as a matter of professional pride. Whether every one of these riflemen deserved the almost mythical reputation later attached to them by frightened Allied soldiers is difficult to say with certainty. Contemporary accounts often blurred the line between genuine marksmen and simple bad luck. What is not in dispute is the psychological effect. Men stopped moving. Men stopped looking. An entire army, dug into a hillside, effectively blinded itself in daylight for fear of what a moment's carelessness might cost. Existing military doctrine offered little help. The rifle, the standard weapon of every infantryman, was designed on the assumption that a soldier could see his target in order to aim at it, which meant exposing his head and shoulders above cover. Trench periscopes existed in a rudimentary form, mostly for observation rather than combat, and were often improvised from cheap mirrors rather than issued as standard kit. There was no accepted method by which a man could both observe an enemy position and fire upon it without presenting himself as a target in the process. The High Command back in London was slow to grasp the specific tactical bind that Gallipoli presented, focused as it was on the broader strategic questions of the campaign. It fell, as so often in this war, to the men actually crouched in the dirt to solve the problem themselves. The solution, when it emerged, is credited most reliably to Lance Corporal William Beach, an Australian soldier serving with the 2nd Battalion, Australian Imperial Force. The solution, when it emerged, is credited most reliably to Lance Corporal William Beach, an Australian soldier serving with the 2nd Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, though various men across the Anzac and British lines appear to have arrived at broadly similar ideas around the same time, a reminder that necessity in the trenches often produced parallel invention rather than a single flash of genius. Beach's idea was disarmingly simple. He took a rifle, most likely a standard Lee Enfield of the type carried by British and Australian infantry, and fixed to it a wooden frame holding 2 small mirrors, one angled above the rifle's sights and one positioned at eye level below. A soldier could then hold the rifle down inside the trench, look into the lower mirror, see the reflected image bounce down from the upper mirror, and align his sights on a target above the parapet without ever raising so much as an eyebrow over the top. The mechanism itself required no great feat of engineering, which was precisely its virtue. 2 mirrors, roughly the size of a small hand mirror or shaving glass, set at matching angles of about 45 degrees, created a simple periscope effect. Light bounced down from the top mirror to the bottom one, presenting the shooter with a clear, if slightly reduced, view of the ground ahead. The frame holding these mirrors was typically built from scrap timber, ammunition boxes, biscuit tins, whatever material happened to be on hand, and lashed or nailed directly onto the rifle's stock and barrel so that the sight picture lined up correctly with the weapon's own sights. Early versions were crude and required a good deal of trial and error to get the angles right. A mirror fixed even a few degrees out of true could throw the shooter's aim off by a distance measured in feet rather than inches at typical trench ranges. Once refined, however, the device allowed a soldier to keep his entire body, head included, below the line of the parapet while still bringing effective, aimed rifle fire onto an enemy position. Word of the invention spread quickly along the Anzac lines, first through simple imitation as men in neighboring trenches saw the device in use and built their own versions, and later through more organized production once officers recognized its value. Workshops were established behind the lines, some little more than a sheltered dugout with a soldier skilled in carpentry, turning out periscope rifle frames in numbers that historians have never been able to pin down with precision, since so much of the manufacture was informal and undocumented at the time. Estimates suggest that thousands of these devices were eventually produced and issued across the Gallipoli front, though exact production figures remain a matter of historical reconstruction rather than surviving official record. Some accounts describe entire sections of trench equipped almost universally with the periscope rifle within a matter of weeks, a remarkably fast adoption for a piece of equipment that began life as a soldier's private improvisation rather than a design handed down from above. In practical terms, the periscope rifle transformed a stretch of trench line from a place of enforced blindness into something closer to an equal contest. Soldiers at positions such as Quinn's Post, one of the most exposed and heavily contested points on the entire Anzac perimeter, made extensive use of the device, firing on Ottoman positions that had previously been able to observe and shoot with near impunity. Accounts from the period describe men lying in the bottom of a trench, rifle braced against a sandbag, eye pressed to the lower mirror, waiting for the telltale movement of an enemy soldier before squeezing the trigger without ever exposing themselves. The psychological effect on the Ottoman defenders appears to have been significant, though records from their side of the line are considerably sparser than those from the Anzac trenches, and much of what can be said about their reaction comes from Allied accounts and later historical analysis rather than direct testimony. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a good deal more to this story still to come. The idea of firing a rifle indirectly, without exposing the shooter, was not unique to the Anzac trenches at Gallipoli, though the specific device and its rapid grassroots adoption gave it a particular character there. French forces on the Western Front experimented with their own periscope-assisted rifles around a similar period, and some German units are known to have developed comparable devices, generally with a similar arrangement of angled mirrors mounted above a standard infantry rifle. German engineering approaches, where documented, tended toward slightly more elaborate and factory-produced designs compared with the improvised, trench-built nature of the Anzac version, though this reflects differing industrial priorities as much as differing ingenuity. American forces, entering the war later and on a different front, do not appear to have relied on the periscope rifle to nearly the same degree, in part because the static, close-range trench conditions of Gallipoli were not universally replicated elsewhere. What distinguished the Anzac periscope rifle was less its technical sophistication, which was modest by any measure, than the speed and thoroughness with which ordinary soldiers adapted it, refined it, and spread it through the ranks without waiting for approval from above. It stands as one of the clearer examples from the First World War of tactical innovation flowing upward from the trenches rather than downward from headquarters. Assessing the true impact of the periscope rifle requires a degree of honesty about what can and cannot be known. It did not end the sniper threat at Gallipoli, nor did it fundamentally alter the strategic course of a campaign that would ultimately end in Allied withdrawal by early 1916. What it did achieve, more modestly but no less meaningfully, was to restore a measure of agency to ordinary infantrymen who had found themselves effectively paralyzed by an enemy they could not safely observe. It allowed men to fire back, to contest ground that had previously belonged entirely to the other side's marksmen, and in doing so it likely saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to reckless attempts to observe or aim in the conventional manner. The device also fed directly into the wider development of sniper doctrine and equipment across the British and Commonwealth forces, with more refined periscope sights and observation devices appearing later in the war on the Western Front, informed in part by lessons learned in the Dardanelles. Today, examples of the original periscope rifle, including devices attributed to Beach himself, are held and displayed in institutions such as the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Tangible reminders of a piece of battlefield ingenuity built from spare timber and shaving mirrors rather than any grand design. Return, for a moment, to that trench at dawn on the 14th of May, to the soldier who cannot look up without risking his life. Within weeks of that moment, on that same stretch of line, another soldier would be doing something that would have seemed almost impossible at the outset of the campaign, watching his enemy, aiming at his enemy, and firing at his enemy, all while keeping his head safely below the level of the earth. Nothing about the periscope rifle was elegant. It was built from tins and timber and mirrors meant for shaving, lashed together in a dugout by men with no formal training in optics or engineering, and yet it did something that months of official effort had failed to do. It gave a frightened, pinned-down soldier back his ability to fight on something closer to equal terms. The story of the periscope rifle is, in the end, a story about the gap between the battlefield as planners imagine it and the battlefield as soldiers actually experience it. Grand strategy decided that men would land at Gallipoli and fight their way inland. It was the men themselves, crouched in narrow trenches under a merciless sun, who worked out how they might actually survive long enough to do so. No single mirror, no single rifle, no single soldier broke the deadlock of sniper warfare at Gallipoli. But together, multiplied across thousands of trenches and thousands of hands, they turned an impossible problem into a merely difficult one. That, in the end, may be the truest measure of the device's success. Not that it won a battle, or a campaign, or a war, but that it gave ordinary men a fighting chance to see without being seen, to aim without dying, in a place where looking up had once been a death sentence in itself.